Good morning and welcome to the Atlantic Council. I'm Josh Lipsky, Chair of International Economics at the Council, and it is my pleasure to welcome you to today's event, The Resurgence of Industrial Policy, Navigating Trade-offs and Opportunities, as we, in partnership with the International Monetary Fund, launch a new chapter, analytical chapter from the World Economic Outlook. We are headed into the IMF World Bank annual meetings. This is actually at the Atlantic Council our first event heading into the IMF World Bank annual meetings, and we could not be more thrilled to host this important event today, launching this chapter on industrial policy. We know the situation around the world, faced with slowing growth, supply chain disruptions, certainly rising geopolitical tensions. Countries, both emerging and advanced markets and developing economies, are increasingly turning to industrial policy. This is not a conversation we'd be having a decade ago at the Atlantic Council, but it is the reality of the global economy today. There are subsidy policies that reshape economies, can also boost productivity, but we know there's no silver bullet for economic resilience, and we know these policies also come with trade-offs. Some of it is little understood, some of it has recently developed around the global economy in recent years, and the IMF today in their new research has dove into the intricacies of these policies and done what the IMF does best, show what's happening around the world, brought new data to the table, and hopefully from it brought new insights for policymakers around the world. So I'm very pleased to welcome Shekhar Iyer, Assistant Director in the Research Department at the IMF, Mehdi Benatia-Andalusi, Economist in the Research Department at the IMF, the co-authors of this new chapter, and Mary Lovely, the Anthony M. Solomon Senior Fellow at the Peterson Institute, who will be our discussant after Mehdi and Shekhar present the key findings. But first, let's get to the paper. Mehdi, I think we're going to start with you. The floor is yours.
Thank you very much, Josh, and thank you to the Atlantic Council for hosting the launch of Chapter 3 of the World Economic Outlook. This is joint work with a team of researchers at the IMF Research Department that are listed on this slide. And the chapter dives into industrial policy. And the context for this chapter is the recent rise in industrial policies as a tool to address growth concerns and global value chain resilience concerns. What you can see here on the left is that over the past 15 years, there's been a rise in the use of industrial policy, and every year the new industrial policies that have been rolled out have been increasing in number. And that's true both for advanced economies and emerging markets. One fact that we document in the chapter is that among all these new industrial policies that were rolled out during this period, about a third targeted energy sector products in green on the right side graph. And that was particularly true in energy-dependent countries, so those countries that rely on imports for their energy needs. Another important fact that we document in the chapter is that subsidies really dominated the type of instruments that were used for industrial policies. And those generated sizable fiscal costs. What you can see on the left is that both for advanced economies and emerging markets, the use of tools such as subsidized financing, so think about subsidies for interest payments for firms, or direct support, so direct grants for firms and sectors, really dominate the landscape for industrial policies. Other policies, such as trade policies, have also played a role, but were much lower in number. It's very hard to pinpoint the exact fiscal cost of industrial policies. And that's because there's a host of different instruments that are used in practice, and so it's very hard to calculate the fiscal size of these instruments. What the chart on the right does is displaying recent estimates by an IMF working paper in red and by an OECD paper in blue that suggest that the fiscal size of industrial policies amounted to a few percentage points of GDP every year, which is quite sizable. So motivated by these facts, the fact that IP is growing in interest, the fact that this could represent a large fiscal cost, this paper and this research asks two key questions. First, what are the implications of industrial policies, those policies that are, by definition, targeting specific sector and firms? What are those implications for those targeted sectors and firms? And second, the broad type of question that we're looking at is what are the macroeconomic effects? In particular, when you think about the cross-sector spillovers from targeted sectors to non-targeted sectors. So let's dive in on the first question. how can we think about the implications of IP at the sectoral level, and under what conditions can they deliver on their promise to improve productivity and production on targeted sectors? So to answer this question, we rely on a stylized model that has two countries, a technology leader that we would think about as the foreign country, and a technology lagger that we would think about as the home country. And the home country will try to use industrial policy to develop an infant industry, those industries that are at an early stage of development in the country and that lag the technology leader. So they don't have an advantage, they don't have an experience in producing the technology that they try to support. And with experience, they can really learn by doing and become more and more efficient. And so the idea is that industrial policy could help build such experience so that the industry could then strive and learn by doing and get to the technology frontier. So this is what you can see here on the left-hand side. So the blue lines are the home country, so the country that rolls out industrial policy in the infant industry to develop it and gain in productivity. And what you can see is that without industrial policy, the model suggests that the home country never really picks up in terms of production costs here on the left-hand side, and always stays for the entire period above the technology leader. So that's the blue dotted line. What IP does is that with subsidies, it helps kickstart the industry, and thanks to learning by doing and the fact that the processes become more and more efficient as firms learn to produce, we see some convergence over the long term to the technology leader. This comes with a trade-off. That's what you can see here on the right-hand side. When we think about IP in this exercise, we're really thinking about both production subsidies and trade protections. And so the trade protections in particular would lead to higher consumer prices in the home country as they lose access to cheap imported goods. And so that's the trade-off, that temporarily industrial policy would entail larger consumer prices for the technology. What's very important to note, and that we really dive into in the chapter, is that those effects of industrial policy very depend on starting conditions. There will not be, for the same industrial policy, convergence if the country starts further away from the frontier, if learning is slow in that industry in the country, or if the market size is slow so that increasing production doesn't find a way to be sold. So that could be the case, for example, in small open economies that lose access to export markets. What we next do in the chapter is two applications of this stylized model. Given the prevalence of energy sector industrial policy, the first application dives into energy sector policies and we take the case of Europe. Europe is a region that is dependent on fossil fuel imports for part of its energy demand, and industrial policy there has been targeting clean technologies that could be used as a substitute for fossil fuels. So think about electric vehicles to replace cars, and solar panel and windmills to replace gas power plants, for example. And so what we do here is that we harness the stylized model that I just presented you, and we really augment it with a macro model to understand both the sector level impacts of clean tech IP and the macro ramifications of these for the economy in Europe. So to do that, we actually look at three policy scenarios that we project over the next 10 years from 2024 to 2035. The first scenario assumes what we call the baseline, assumes that the observed subsidies and tariff that exist in 2024 in Europe continue unchanged until 2035. No IP scenario assumes that all subsidies that exist in 2024 and all tariffs that exist in 2024 in that sector are removed. And a third scenario assumes that Europe increases subsidies for clean tech manufacturing to try and onshore a large part of the products in this sector that would be installed. So under the two scenarios that are of interest, so the no IP scenario and the reshoring scenario, what the model suggests is that the prices of clean tech would drop significantly in the next 10 years. And so that's what the right-hand side graph shows. But importantly, the sources of these price declines are very different. In the no IP scenario, access to cheaper imports, thanks to the removal of tariff, leads to a large part of the price reduction. While the reshoring scenario onshores a lot of the production, and thanks to learning by doing, European producers manage to become more efficient and more cost competitive, and that also leads to a drop in the production costs and in the prices of clean technology. With cheaper clean technologies, adoption increases, and Europe in these two scenarios manages to weave itself off some of the fossil fuel imports that it relies on for energy demand. But there's a big difference to consider between the two policy options, what we think about as trade-off. On the one hand, industrial policy, under the conditions that we look at in this model, does reshore a large part of the production into Europe, and that has ramifications for the labor markets. We see on the left-hand side that under industrial policy, about almost 1% of the labor force relocates to clean tech manufacturing in Europe. So IP is successful in the sense that it does reshore clean tech manufacturing, it does protect jobs in that sector, but this comes with a trade-off, and that's the right-hand side. So we estimate the fiscal cost of this assumed policy, and this is really a theoretical exercise, would amount to about 80 billion euros per year, which is about 0.4% of GDP for the region, and is quite sizable. That amounts, to give you an example, of about half of current EU-wide budget. And when you think about the cost per job created, that would be about 30,000 euros per job created. So the conclusion of this exercise is that in that specific example, IP can deliver on its promise, but it comes at a fiscal cost. The chapter then dives into two other case studies that are more historical, Korea and Brazil in the 70s, where we dive into what worked in Korea and what didn't work in other examples. And the chapter insists that both the design, the targeting of the proper sectors, but the implementation and complementary policies are all essential in helping for the success of industrial policy. And Sheka will now present the empirical analysis in the chapter.
Thank you, Mehdi.
Thanks. So then the next sector, the next chapter, the next section of the chapter does an empirical investigation at the sectoral level of the impact of industrial policy. We do this through a local projections method following Bucky et al. And what we are looking at is the change in the stock of industrial policies. So we look at the change in the stock, so that's like the flow, and we examine what is the impact on three outcomes: value added in the targeted sector, total factor productivity in the targeted sector, and allocative efficiency. So when we do this, we find that there is indeed a modest link between IPs and targeted sector economic performance. So let's start with direct support and subsidized financing, which are the two instruments we use. You can see from the left-hand side chart that direct support seems to deliver positive results for all three variables that we're considering, which are value added, productivity, and allocative efficiency. Subsidized financing tends to go in the same direction, but the results are insignificant. Now, we also find that country characteristics matter. In particular, we find that, you can see from the blue bars that for advanced economies, there are these positive effects coming on all three of the variables that we consider, but this is not true for EMDEs. And in particular, if you look at subsidized financing, it seems that it actually has a negative effect on allocative efficiency, although it's not significant. Turning to differences in industries, we split the sample into infant industries and mature industries. Infant industries are defined as those which have a large amount of young, financially constrained firms which are not too far but have some gap with the world technology frontier. And the interesting finding here is that there does appear to be subsidized financing which only appears to benefit infant industries but not mature industries, unlike direct support. This could be because financial constraints play a large part, and subsidized financing is one way to try to target that. Now, in this exercise, we examine spillovers, which, if you have IP in an upstream sector like energy, and you know that energy has a lot of downstream links with industries that use energy as an input, then you might expect that IP in the upstream sector also has ramifications for the downstream sector. So the left-hand chart shows that if you do IP in upstream energy sectors, it does indeed have a positive productivity impact on those energy sectors itself. But turning to the middle chart, you can see that it also has a positive impact on value added in downstream users of energy. However, departing from this positive effect, if you look at the extreme right-hand side chart, it appears to have a negative impact on allocative efficiency. And this could be because the firms do not equally benefit from cheaper energy. There might be differences in the energy mix or the energy uses of downstream sectors, and to the extent that you're subsidizing the upstream providers, this could have non-uniform effects on the downstream sector and actually reduce allocative efficiency. Okay, now very quickly, because we're kind of running out of time, one important thing that Mehdi has emphasized and that I just related in what I showed you is that in some sense it's obvious that if you have subsidies to a targeted sector, the targeted sector will benefit. It would be very strange if it didn't. But fiscal resources are limited, and in order to target one sector, you often withdraw resources from other sectors. So in order to get a rounded view of the impact of industrial policy on the economy as a whole, you need to consider the impact on both the sectors that were targeted and those that weren't. And this is what we do using a quantitative trade model. So in particular, the first scenario that we examine is a subsidy just to the energy sector. Now, unlike the previous examples that Mehdi was talking about in Europe, where we were focusing just on clean tech, here we are focusing on the energy sector as a whole. So there are subsidies given to the energy sector. From the left-hand side chart, you can see, unsurprisingly, this raises production, employment, and also has a slight upward impact on productivity in the energy sector. However, it withdraws resources from non-energy sectors, and some of these non-energy sectors also have increasing returns to scale. So when you remove resources from them, then productivity in those non-targeted sectors falls. So on the right-hand side chart, you can see that when you add those effects up, there is actually a negative effect on aggregate productivity in the economy. At the same time, because of the subsidies to the energy sector, there is a reduction in energy imports. There is also a sizable fiscal cost of almost 2% of GDP. So one way of thinking about this is that there is an inherent trade-off here between energy self-reliance on the one hand and efficiency and fiscal cost on the other. And that is what is illustrated here. Okay, we also do a second scenario where instead of just targeting the energy sector, we target every single sector in the economy which has increasing returns to scale. When you do this, unsurprisingly, there is a positive impact on productivity, as you can see in the left-hand side chart. And if you now look at the right-hand side chart, there is also a positive effect on aggregate productivity for the whole economy. Again, not surprising because you're targeting very precisely every sector in the economy with increasing returns to scale and giving them subsidies. However, it comes at a hefty fiscal cost of about 5% of GDP. So in fiscally straitened times, that is a trade-off that governments will have to keep in mind. Let me turn now quickly to our conclusions. We show in the chapter that well-targeted subsidies do have the potential to correct market failures and boost productivity over time. And there are successful cases in the past, such as Korea. However, there is a high risk of policy mistakes. Sector-level success depends on key sectoral characteristics like the degree of returns to scale, the degree of learning by doing, the distance from the frontier, all these things, and it's very difficult to target them precisely because governments may not have the correct or the precise information needed. There is also, of course, the risk of rent-seeking or political capture by favored clients. The fiscal costs can be very high, so even if it's well-targeted and beautifully executed, it can still carry a hefty fiscal cost, and every fiscal cost represents an opportunity cost. You are not doing something that you could have been doing instead of industrial policy. And finally, IP presents trade-offs, even when designed and executed well. As we've pointed out, there are trade-offs between targeted sectors and non-targeted sectors. When you take this into account, the aggregate impact might well be negative. There can be trade-offs, as we document, between efficiency and resilience. IP could succeed in onshoring targeted industries, but at the risk of elevated consumer prices. So what are the policy implications? First, be mindful of the risk of wasteful spending from poorly targeted and poorly governed IPs, particularly in the current fiscal context. Secondly, carefully consider opportunity costs. It may well be that structural reforms which do not need the kind of sector-specific knowledge and targeting that industrial policy requires might deliver superior outcomes. And then be aware that there are trade-offs between competing goals. If you have a goal to onshore production and you also have a goal to reduce consumer prices, be aware that you may not be able to satisfy both those goals. If IP is pursued, focus on good design and implementation. This involves identifying the market failure and targeting appropriately, continuously looking at the success of the program and recalibrating if necessary, having competition between firms so that the money is not being wasted, and having good governance, for example, sunset clauses which phase out subsidies after a certain amount of time. Government should also be aware that IP succeeds best when there are good complementary policies in place, good governance, easy access to credit for everybody who wants it and has a good idea, and a well-educated workforce. So these are all important considerations for the success of IP. With that, thank you very much. I would like to thank Josh Lipsky for hosting us and for Mary to agreeing to be our discussant. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Sheikh. I appreciate that. And thanks to you and your colleagues at the IMF for this important research, which could not be more timely. Mary, I'm going to turn the floor to you.
Okay, thank you very much, Josh. I think from the discussion we had, you can see what a rich chapter this really is. It's really a primer on industrial policy, theoretically, empirically, and of course the case studies. I think it'd be incredibly useful, for example, in master's classes on international economics and on government policy more broadly. So congratulations on a really terrific and interesting and worthwhile chapter. The chapter combines theory and empirics, which is really nice because the theory kind of shows the reader and guides the analysis in a way that's very helpful. It's an example of how how this works. Is first they start with counts to show us that industrial policy is highly prevalent. Interesting to note that most of the counts happen in the advanced economies, not the emerging markets, even though it's growing in both sets of countries. The theoretical model emphasizes a lagging sector, and that helps to illuminate pathways for successful implementation. It really points the researcher in the direction of what is it that matters, and they really play that out in the chapter. The chapter also presents this regression analysis looking at the effectiveness of industrial subsidies that I think is really interesting and a very valuable contribution, looking at its effect on very important outcomes such as employment and TFP or total factor productivity. The simulations then explore some of the general equilibrium implications. Again, I think an interesting and useful contribution. And then we have case studies that go over fairly well-trodden ground, which is Brazil and South Korea. Interestingly enough, though, these are exactly the countries, particularly South Korea, that are being mentioned by advanced economies now. So thinking about how different that context is, I think helps today's policymakers to realize that perhaps that is not what we're dealing with today. The survey of the IP usage is very instructive, particularly because it tells us that enhancing competitiveness in strategic sectors is a primary motive, and therefore that, of course, leads to geoeconomic competition. Over 1/3 of the interventions are in the energy sector. Is that good news? It really depends on how you view climate change and which part of the energy sector, fossil fuel or clean tech, is being emphasized. Over 80% of the interventions were by advanced economies, as I mentioned earlier, which I think is fascinating because we don't think about them as needing help with infant industries. Subsidies and subsidized financing are preferred tools, which is very interesting in and of itself because a lot of these are financed by debt. So basically, policymakers today are borrowing from the future. And therefore, that if you think of it from an intergenerational perspective, places even more onus on them to get this right because you're leaving this debt to your children. And as the chapter shows repeatedly, the fiscal costs of IP are sizable. And so this is not just a twinkle. This is important. Some findings are not surprising, but they're still very useful to see in the report. Key factors in success of IP for industry motives, as Mehdi particularly emphasized: targeting correctly, how far is your country from the frontier, how quickly the domestic sector can catch up, and will the country be able to access a large enough market to reach scale? These are all really difficult questions for the government to ask and answer, and yet they're critically important to get right if you want to have a successful program. So these theoretical insights guide analysis that follows in the chapter, and there's a very new and useful database that I hope is used by many researchers moving forward. The study of spillovers breaks new ground in the report. They use a multi-sector quantitative model to examine general equilibrium spillovers from one sector to another. And while that's a lot of econ-ese, I think it's really important to say you can't subsidize certain sectors without hindering others. And this is vitally important at a time when we have politicians running around saying, look over here, look at this shiny new thing, these new jobs. Well, there's going to be jobs lost in other areas. Allocative efficiency in the economy means that you have this concern about subsidizing sectors that are actually going to drag down total TFP, something that the report shows is possible. Infant industry lens is very useful, and it's important, I think, particularly in the context of emerging markets and for particular sectors. But I think it abstracts from a lot of real-world trade, particularly as it, with respect to advanced economies today. And as mentioned earlier, they are the primary users of industrial policy. Infant industry motive assumes that domestic firms are not exporting because they're technologically inferior. Yet the sectors that are targeted for IP today are often dominated by multinational corporations, which are indeed exporting, but from multiple platform sites. So this would include things like autos, semiconductors, mining. How do we think about IP in that context? Also, the infant industry model has no role for international fragmentation, yet trade in producer inputs organized along global value chains is vitally important both to how we could characterize trade today and to growth and productivity that we've experienced over the last 20 years. Reshoring seeks to deliberately break up these chains. Reshoring means we want more of these fragments to be done at home. And I think that IP can be productivity reducing in that sense. And we have to think about, okay, in some sectors, maybe for economic resilience, economic security, we need that. We need, fill in the blank, generic drugs to be produced onshore as opposed to in Asia. But that's going to come at a cost. And you can't have securitization of everything in the economy without ossifying the economy. The work, I think, should be expanded to other forms of economies of scale. As I said earlier to Shekhar, I'm greedy. I like this chapter. I think that this work should be expanded. How should we think about scale economies in particular industries? Are they internal or external to the firm? Infant industry says they're external to the firm. You get the industry bigger, you're going to have a more productive sector. And the prevalence of industry clustering, labor market pooling, innovative hubs suggests that external economies are powerful. But how do we think about those external economies? Are they national or international in scope? In this chapter, they're national. But when we think about global value chains, we see that they're actually international. The US is now subsidizing its semiconductor sector, but it's not an infant industry. We create the chips. So it's not fitting the traditional mold, and yet it's something that's going to receive a lot of fiscal support. So interventionist policies have very different outcomes from the infant industry case when economies of scale are external and international in scope, and I think that needs to be studied more carefully. I think the infant industry lens also ignores other industrial policy motives that need to be considered, and this is very difficult to do, and certainly not a fault of the chapter. But technological lags are often not the main reason for industrial policy. It could be to retain non-competitive traditional sectors. Sectors where there's a large political constituency that needs to be supported. Agriculture in certain countries, for example. Resource sectors with constant returns for security purposes. So, for example, active ingredients in pharmaceuticals, or to control choke points in supply chains. And I think that these are all very important, particularly for the advanced economy strategies that we're talking about today. Heading to conclude here, I think trade policy should be in the discussion more prominently. As Mehdi mentioned, infant industry must be coupled with tariffs or some kind of protective wall. Otherwise, the industry won't have the chance to actually gain scale behind that protective wall. We're seeing an awful lot of use of tariffs these days. How do we think about that? Tariffs close domestic market for catch-up, but they have negative internal and external market effects that spill over to others. Lastly, just to emphasize, I think more is needed. The conclusions in this report are extremely well grounded in solid theory and empirical analysis, and I think they'll be very useful in providing practical policy guidance. I think more research is needed on industrial policy, serving new motives and under more realistic, at least for advanced economies, economic and political conditions. The report also notes that overall structural reforms typically bring larger benefits than industrial policy. So then the question that arises is, why are they not being used? For example, a lot of these industrial policies are being implemented through subsidized financing. In advanced economies, why is that needed when they have capital markets that work relatively well? And when we think about infant industry, is it that the infant industry needs a tariff and the government controls tariffs, but then the capital market can do the rest? Is governmental financing really needed? Of course, this is an old view in some sense on IP, but I think still a very relevant one, particularly when we see the number of interventions that happen in advanced economies. Okay, thanks very much for a great report, guys.
Thank you, Mary. And I'm actually going to pick up with my questions where you left off. I have a few questions for the panel, and then we're going to get to the audience as well. So please use skc.org. I'll get to as many questions as I can in about the 25 minutes we have left. But I was going to ask about China, and I'm going to ask about the US, but I want to start where you ended, Mary, and turn to the authors here about why not structural reforms? The conclusion Mary put out is very clear. Obviously, this can generate growth. We know this. This goes back for years of IMF policy guidance. You show the trade-off between IP and structural reforms, and yet we know what countries are pursuing. So what's your conclusion, having done this research now, of why we're not seeing more pursuit of structural reforms and seeing more turn to this sort of IP in a range of economies, not just developing markets and emerging economies, but advanced economies as well?
Yeah, thanks, Josh. That's a great question, and thank you, Mary, for bringing it up. We think it's extremely important, and there's a box in the chapter devoted to exactly this question. So structural reforms are reforms which are not targeting particular sectors, but are affecting all the sectors in the economy. And the paper finds, based on a recent working paper by Bucky and others at the IMF, that in fact, structural reforms seem to have larger effects, at least in some of the policy experiments that we've run. So for example, if you have structural reforms, they can raise value added in highly distorted sectors by around 2%, compared to only 0.2% coming from targeting those sectors through industrial policy. So that suggests that at least in some circumstances, structural policies can have a bigger bang for the buck. Again, we find that if you try to ease credit access for everybody by making credit markets functioning better, just like Mary alluded to with capital markets in advanced economies, that tends to have a more vigorous impact on the economic outcomes than targeted policies. That's one. The second point to note is that the sectoral policies will typically carry larger fiscal costs. The structural reforms may also carry fiscal costs, but often they don't, and in some cases they can even reduce the fiscal constraints. For example, tax reforms, which are a kind of structural policy, may serve to increase revenue rather than to reduce it. Finally, they are not necessarily substitutes, but complements. So there's a large body of work which shows that structural reforms are often a necessary condition, or perhaps not quite so strong as saying a necessary condition, but at least help with the impact of targeted policies. So for example, if you've got good governance structures, a decent business environment, if you've got a well-educated workforce, then industrial policy tends to work better, pointing to complementarities between structural reforms and industrial policies.
That makes sense. And I think, Mary brought this up as well. It's important to think about this diffusion of structural reforms where the payoff doesn't come to any particular sector in any immediate gratification kind of timeline, whereas we see right now with industrial policies, and you said this, Mary, the ability and need to hold up the shiny object sometime can really motivate policymakers, but as you outline in the paper, we should be aware of the cost associated. Okay, I've waited long enough to ask about China, so Mehdi, over to you. You discuss China in depth in the paper, as makes sense in a paper on industrial policies. There's a fascinating box I direct everyone to, box 3.1 in the paper. As always with the IMF, you got to go into the boxes and see the fantastic research that's done. So check out box 3.1. But there you show the fiscal cost of industrial policy in China was about 4% of GDP from 2011 to 2023. There's been a range of estimates on this. I know colleagues at CSIS and others have done this kind of work, but it's a significant amount of investment from Chinese policymakers over the past decade. And you say most of it's directed to manufacturing, as we know, semiconductors, high-tech manufacturing, and automobiles benefiting. We're certainly see the payoff, especially when it comes to automobiles. We think of the EV sector in China right now. And I wonder if you could outline for us a little more the cost side of it, because if you're thinking from the Chinese perspective, I think you'd look at the EV sector and some of the other investments, semiconductors as well, and say, yes, this has been a heavy cost, but it's also paying dividends at the moment.
Thank you, Josh. And as you mentioned, we have a box in the chapter that draws on recent research from IMF staff that does two things. So the first thing you said is they develop methods to actually measure what were the fiscal costs of industrial policy in China over the past 15 years. And they find, as you mentioned, that it was quite sizable, about 4% of GDP every year. And it targeted strategic sectors such as electric vehicles and had some success there. So the early policies that targeted EVs in China started in 2009 when really EVs were at the infant stage globally. And now we know that they have a competitive advantage in the production of batteries and electric vehicles, as we document also in the appendix. The flip side of this, which the box also develops from this working paper, is that on top of the fiscal cost, there's also economic costs that could seem to be hidden. As we show in the paper for in a cross-country setting, industrial policy that target a specific sector could draw resources away from other sectors that would be more productive than typically the targeted sectors is sometimes. And that could create a misallocation in the economy and reduce aggregate productivity. And so that's something that the box documents also in the case of China. And they find that this increased misallocation may have actually shaved growth in China by about 2% in the past 15 years. And so, as in other countries, IP can deliver on specific sectors. We also find in the paper that it can improve allocation when it's well targeted, but when overdone or when not targeted well enough, it could create misallocation and actually be a drag on growth.
Thank you. And Mary, let me turn to you on the China question, what you draw from this in the report on China. If they see this as a Chinese policymaker, I don't think there'd be a lot in the paper they'd be surprised about. But is there any policy change you think we'd see in China in the coming years?
Well, there certainly has been policy change. I would add that there's also a fiscal federalism, or the center versus the local issue. That's not just an issue for China, it's also an issue for the United States, because US states engage in industrial policy in the sense of subsidizing new factories that come into their boundaries. In China, over time, early on we saw most of the industrial policy was being done at the provincial and local level. At the central government was really focused on what we might think of as structural reforms prior to Chinese accession to the WTO and even up to the global financial crisis. And there was a lot of local experimentation in industrial policy. Some researchers even pointed to this as kind of a secret elixir for China, because local provincial governments were able to tailor the set of activities that they were subsidizing to their local endowments. So in some sense, they were fitting the local situation. Since about 2014 and moving on, my own work and work that's come out recently from the NBER have shown that these policies have been increasingly centralized, and they're moving to conform with what the State Council at the central government level has identified as key sectors. And that causes some issues. We're seeing sort of over-subsidization in the EV sector and so-called involution, where prices are falling so quickly. And of course, there's going to have to be a shakeout in the industry. That means there's probably been both good experimentation, but also a lot of waste that will have to be absorbed by the Chinese taxpayer. So there's been enormous change over time, and I think it is a very interesting area for more research as to how within a large and diversified economy like the European Union, like the United States, like China, the actual institutional structure for IP should be organized.
Thank you. No, it's helpful, and that's obviously something we're going to continue to look to the fund for in the years ahead to see the changes in policy should they develop. You mentioned the United States, Mary, so let's get to the United States and let's talk about advanced economies, because this is one of the findings that jumps out from the paper. The amount of industrial policy that's happening in advanced economies is surprising to me. We sort of have felt it anecdotally, but to see it categorized like this in the paper, I think is very instructive. And I think about the last 5 years at the GeoEconomics Center. We had Secretary Mizunich, who was the Deputy Secretary at Treasury in the first Trump administration, come give an industrial policy speech. That was the end of the first Trump administration. We had Brian Deese, who was then Director of the National Economic Council, come to the Atlantic Council, give an industrial policy speech. We had Secretary Yellen talk about friendshoring. So we felt this change across both parties in the United States. But here we are in this new era of industrial policy. And my question to the paper authors is, what does industrial policy mean in the largest economy in the world, largest advanced economy in the world, and the economy with the most deep, liquid, open capital markets in the world? Is there something different about industrial policy in the United States that some of the findings and trade-offs might look different if applied in the US context? Easy question, so I don't know who wants to take it at the authors.
I can have a stab at it, and then my colleagues can jump in. I think there are many lessons to be drawn from this, but first let me try to clarify something that Mary also brought up. There's this idea of infant industry protection, which doesn't perhaps sit well with the idea that we're talking about advanced economies, because one expects advanced economies to be at the global technological frontier. In fact, this is not true in some industries. So for example, if you look at EVs or you look at solar panels, it is not true that the West is the technological leader. That would be China. So I think one can still look usefully at traditional infant industry arguments, as we do in the paper, to kind of model the policymaker's dilemma. In terms of what are the takeaways for a rich Western country like the US, I think they are the ones that I listed. There are lots of trade-offs that policymakers need to be aware of. Often there are competing goals to IP, and it is not clear that you can actually satisfy all of them at the same time. You may not be able to reshore and reduce consumer prices, at least not without introducing additional elements. Secondly, be aware of opportunity costs. Mary made the important point that it's, IPs often carry a disguised cost. So, it is part of the fiscal burden, and the fiscal burden currently in many advanced economies is very elevated. Public debt levels are soaring in many countries in the world. So at this time in particular, a good assessment of the opportunity costs and what could be the alternative uses of those public resources would be well sought after. And finally, good targeting is just as vital in advanced economies as it would be in emerging markets. So if you're going to support an industry, you need to make sure that the policymakers understand what are the returns to scale, what is the rate of learning by doing, what is the distance from the frontier, so that they can come up with a targeted plan to deliver the maximum value for the buck without squandering resources.
And of course, if you have hundreds of billions in CapEx AI investment, that helps as well in an economy. You can balance out some of the costs. No, point well taken, Shekhar. Okay, I have one more question, and then I want to get to the audience, so please get your questions ready. I'll call on people here in the room, and then also take some of the online questions. But I want to talk about this international spillover. This paper doesn't focus on that, and you make that very clear. This is about domestic industrial policies. But I wonder if there was another WEO chapter coming in the spring or the fall, not to assign more work to the research department here, how you would approach that. Because this to me seems a core missing question that would further this work, because the industrial policies don't happen in a vacuum, they're happening competitively. And countries are seeing what they're doing, they're trying to protect their own industries, and you could get this race to the bottom. And I wonder how you would go about pursuing that kind of work in the future. So. Mehdi, you're shaking your head, so I'll turn to you.
Yes, no, thank you, Josh, and thank you so much for reminding us that the core topic of this chapter was really to think about the domestic implications of industrial policy, and the reason why we wanted to focus on that is because typically policymakers would want to first know what will be the effect of the policies that they roll out on their domestic economy. And so we've expanded on that during the presentation. We really wanted to document the potential benefits from industrial policy from a domestic perspective, but also the risks that they don't deliver and the trade-offs, and give some implementation tools to make implementation better for industrial policy domestically. We haven't touched upon the international ramification of industrial policies, but we actually cite existing work at the IMF that looks at the cross-border effects of industrial policy. So what happens when a country does industrial policy on its trading partners, for example. And so for that type of question, that's really the key is to look at the quantitative trade models would tell you what are exactly those spillovers. And it's important to note that we've seen in the data, and a recent working paper from the IMF shows that could also trigger some retaliation from other countries and a race to the bottom, in particular when thinking about subsidies. That could be very wasteful on a global level, where every country tries to subsidize the same industries, and actually the benefits of IP are then much lower on a global level.
That's helpful. So we'll look forward to that research from the fund in the months and years ahead.
If I could just add a thought to that, Josh. You mentioned that all our most interesting stuff is in boxes. We have a box highlighting some work from our European department, where they find that when they did subsidies, indeed the targeted firm benefited in some way, but other firms in the same sector in other countries within Europe actually had negative outcomes, which were quite long-lasting. So after the initial subsidy, these negative impacts. And so there's a cross-border dilemma here. So to the extent that Europe is a single market, the argument is that perhaps this should be better coordinated, because if countries are just doing it by themselves, then there are negative spillovers for firms in other countries that didn't receive that subsidy.
That's a very helpful issue to highlight, and that's a lesson I learned when I was working at the fund about the boxes, and I've tried to always go there first when I read these reports, but I think it's important to highlight Europe in this context.
We like thinking inside the box.
Yes. Okay, questions, please raise your hand. Anyone in the room? Ambassador Fried, please, and introduce yourself. We'll bring you a mic.
Yeah, I understood some of what you were saying. It seemed to me your bottom line was a limited and qualified acknowledgement that sometimes industrial policy could work, but you have to watch out for the downsides. Okay. For someone like me, who is not fluent in IMF dialect, the next iteration, a do's and don'ts paper, might be useful if the culture permits a policy prescriptive rather than pure analytic piece, and I don't know whether it does. A second thing I kept thinking of, and it was implied in your piece, I think, was that industrial policy exists not against a pure background, but exists against a background of specific problems. For instance, the concentration of certain key industries in certain countries. Chips in Taiwan. The odds of a Chinese invasion of Taiwan are not zero. There is a non-zero chance of a major war. In which case, that's a catastrophe. It's a kind of nightmare briefing to a US president. In which case, the policy itch that would want to be scratched would be industrial policy to protect chip production or other critical industries. Truly critical, not critical because you're a lobbyist for them, but actually critical. As you were speaking, I was putting on my old policy hat. How do you brief this to a US president? Some US president? Because it struck me as a valuable unpacking of the problem, which I appreciated. But I want to see the next step. And I don't know that you could do it. There may be some IMF rules, written or otherwise, that would prevent you from doing something that was more policy prescriptive. But I kept thinking, they're onto something. This is serious work. So I'm encouraging you to take the next step and to do something that a whole bunch of people like me, possibly the least qualified person in the room to actually read and understand your report, could get my arms around. So thank you very much. It's a serious piece of work. Instead of just repeating orthodoxy, you're diving into the issues. So thank you.
Thanks, Dan. I think it's a good question, especially as we go into the annual meetings. When you present this kind of work to finance ministers, and we've been in these rooms, we've been in these meetings where they say, that's very nice, thank you very much, and then I'm going to go about and pursue my policies. How do you talk about this in the current context in a way that can actually effectuate some change?
So, I mean, I think you're right. There are many objectives for industrial policy, and they are not limited to economic objectives. There are national security objectives. There are objectives to do with resilience. In our paper, for example, we focus on the energy sector. And for a lot of countries, reducing dependence on fossil fuel imports is a matter which is at least as non-economic as it is economic. They feel it's necessary for various grounds which have little to do with economics. So what we show in the paper is that, yes, with a certain set of targeted IPs, you can reduce your energy reliance on imports, but it comes with certain costs for productivity, for efficiency, for economic growth. So I think as economists, what we can do is present these trade-offs to policymakers, and then elected politicians and policymakers will need to take a call about the trade-offs between the economic aspects of it and the non-economic aspects. But as economists, what we can do is present what the economic consequences of a particular policy action are going to be, and then, of course, it is the job of policymakers to take a holistic view of how to act upon that advice.
Mary?
Yeah, I mean, I think this is a great question, and there's so much in this report that could be fodder for that. I think it's really a task beyond the IMF. Yeah, there's definitely follow-up studies here, and I've already made my peace with that. But when economists talk about allocative efficiency, most people have no idea what we're talking about. And sometimes I'm like, is it across, within the sector? Is it across sectors? You know, even as a PhD trained economist, I have some trouble sometimes with this idea. How do we explain this to the population so that when the politician holds up the shiny new thing, jobs are coming here, the public asks the right question, right? Because if we're just speaking to the politicians, they already know, I'm going to get elected because I just put this shiny new shovel in the ground. People have to ask, how much is it going to cost in terms of raising the federal budget deficit or whatever country, or US, whatever country? How much is it going to cost in the fact that other sectors will have to die? We can't have a manufacturing resurgence without a shrinking of the service sector. There's only so many workers. There's only so much capital. We can bring in more capital, but again, where is that going to go? So I think these are important questions, and I think it's vitally important now that economists learn to speak to the public, and that's a really hard job.
Thank you.
But I'm not sure it only is the job, or even is the job of the IMF alone.
So I have about 3 minutes left, and I want to get to one of these online questions, which I think is a good one. And the question here is essentially, not all industrial policies are created equal. And so what surprised you in the research, your priors coming in about what industrial policies could do? It's obviously country dependent based on that economy. But was there something that stood out to either of you in the research that you thought coming in, oh, I think that's going to have less of an impact or more of an impact than it did, and you walked away on the other side saying, oh, that industrial policy operated differently than I would have expected?
I think the case studies were really where we learned, what makes an industrial policy successful, and in what cases it could be less successful. In the case of Korea, that's been documented in the academic literature as of late, is very telling. A lot of papers currently find that industrial policies that were rolled out in the 70s continue to have lasting effects on competitiveness of certain sectors in South Korea. And so that was a piece of research that surprised me, particularly, the long-term effects of industrial policy in certain cases.
Shekhar, anything on your end?
I think for me, what stood out a little bit were the impacts that we got in the general equilibrium quantitative trade model, because it's often been observed by many people, including Mary just now, that when you look at empirical work, it tends to focus on targeted sectors. So you really do need to move to a modeling exercise in order to look at what is the general equilibrium effect on the economy. And I think our findings show how easy it is to get things wrong, and how the unanticipated but hidden aggregate costs for the economy could often be negative, even while you think it's positive because the targeted sector is booming. So I think that sheds light on a very subtle element which policymakers need to be cognizant of.
Okay, final minute. I'll take the moderator's prerogative and ask you each a concluding question. So same question to the panel, and Mary, I'll start with you and work down the row, which is the forward-looking question. The name of this event is the resurgence of industrial policy. Are we on just a continued upward trajectory here, or do you think in the years to come there'll be some reevaluation, maybe in part thanks to the work of our colleagues at the fund, that reevaluate some of the trade-offs that we had taken for granted in previous years, but are now re-experimenting with industrial policy?
So look into the crystal ball. I think we have a ways to go in the current wave of industrial policy. I think that we will see industrial policy operating through off-budget items like tariffs, and that it's going to be bigger than our neighbor. At some point, will we see the wisdom of general prosperity through markets and market forces? I think in some sectors we will, but we're not there yet.
Thank you. Mehdi.
So we document in the chapter that geoeconomic fragmentation could be also behind some of the motivations for industrial policy and the rise of industrial policy that we see in the data. And that could be also a continuing force in the future. As policymakers think about non-economic goals for industrial policies, such as national security, that could be a force for more IP to come.
JK.
It's always bad to go third. Maybe I can point to the fact that fiscal costs are very elevated, and in the current environment with public debt levels soaring, I think at some point there will be a reckoning in terms of how costly these policies are and can they be sustained given the kind of purse string constraints that we have.
I think that's a good note to end on. Mary, Mehdi, Shekhar, thank you. Thank you for the work. Thank you to our colleagues at the International Monetary Fund. You can find this research at imf.org. And this is the first, as I mentioned, event of our IMF World Bank annual meetings at the Atlantic Council. You can find our full lineup at atlanticcouncil.org. We invite you to join us throughout the week. We invite you to join the IMF and the World Bank for their series of programmings. Congratulations on the analytical work. We look forward to collaborating in the months ahead. Thanks everyone for joining us here at the Council and for watching online. We wish everyone a pleasant rest of the day.